My name is Scott Bybee from Tech Data, and I'm here today to give you a deep dive into our Talos product. It's a middleware configuration management solution for various middleware runtimes and helping to create and the goal of the product, of course, is to help create a consistent view of all your configurations, avoid the need to script, and very quickly migrate from one environment to another, from one environment to the cloud, from traditional middleware to microservices-based architectures. This is a deep dive. We will be trying to focus on features and various aspects of Talos to support in that middleware configuration management. There is a series of videos from a colleague of mine by the name of Philip Leeper. This presents a great high-level overview of migrating from on-premise into the cloud and presents the various ways in which Talos can support such migration. The videos are fairly simple in nature by design, 5 minutes or so each, about 4 videos plus an introduction, and I highly recommend, if this is your first exposure to Talos, to start with that. So having said that, let's go ahead and dive into our deep dive. Talos is a middleware configuration management solution within the DevOps chain of tools. It is, to be specific, the focus of the product is around that middleware, so the operations side of DevOps. So to create a consistent view on all the various middleware runtimes that we manage. We want to be able to discover those middleware topologies, manage them in some way, maybe change the topology, migrate that middleware instance into a cloud, build it out automatically in the cloud, and more importantly, create manageable configuration chunks or components out of that, templates as we call them. So we want to be able to read in a configuration, create a global template that might include security parameters and so forth. Or we may want to create a very application-centric. So if we're looking at a Java runtime, we've got an application, it consumes this data source, this JMS queue, we want to bundle that into a template so that we can then marry that with the build and release process. So the process of creating that configurable component, pulling it out of the runtime and then moving it, tokenizing it, creating the variability parts so that when we move it into QA and production, we apply the appropriate values for QA and production and so forth. So that's really the focal point. We've got some ancillary use cases around comparing environments to each other for consistency purposes or generating templates. We've got our integration with Docker, which I'll demonstrate today, and a few other various use cases that I'll show. I presented this slide initially so you can see the various middleware that we manage. I'll probably focus on, well, I will focus on WebSphere Application Server, but be aware that we integrate with a variety of others. I may give a little splash of what it looks like for an F5 appliance or MQ and so forth so you get a feel for it, but I will focus on WebSphere Application Server. We do integrate directly with various public clouds, including Azure, SoftLayer, or Bluemix as they're calling it now. Everything's under the Bluemix banner these days, and as well as AWS. So we've got the three, what I consider the 3 major cloud providers, well 3 of the biggest anyway. We've got direct API level integration with those. We also integrate with a variety of orchestration engines. As I mentioned, we focus on middleware configuration management and transforming that into the cloud, into Docker, into a microservices architecture and so forth. We don't look at the bigger picture in terms of orchestration. So we will automatically generate operational steps to apply those configurations as part of a broader software development, build and release life cycle. And so to that end, we've got integrations with Urban Code, HP Operations Orchestration, Jenkins, and Ansible. Today I'll be showing a demonstration with Jenkins. Of course, I'll be happy to give any sort of demo that might be requested on Urban Code or any of the orchestration engines we work with. In terms of my contact details, in case you didn't catch that, it is scottbybee@techdata.com. Feel free to drop me an email anytime, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So, in order to try to get through as much as we possibly can, I will go ahead and log into my VMware image and into Talos. This is our graphical interface for Talos. We have a command line interface, we have a graphical interface as well as a RESTful API. So you can work with Talos. Anything that you do in the console, we do it behind the scenes via REST, and we expose that, of course, to to the client, so to the end customer, I should say. So you're free to use those RESTful interfaces as well. You don't necessarily have to work with the GUI, though it is helpful in generating templates and so forth. So I'm going to focus in on 4 basic core use case scenarios within Talos. The first one is around building out middleware, discovering middleware. So if I want to discover a pre-existing one so that I can manage it in Talos, maybe I want to then clone that into the cloud, or just clone it on locally on-premise, or I want to change the topology. Maybe I discover it and then I want to add an additional node and generate a new project into my orchestration engine to then rebuild that middleware. So building out using a wizard, discovering that middleware, managing that middleware, cloning that middleware, that's one set of use cases, and I'll demonstrate that shortly. The next set of use cases is around templating, a very key feature within Talos. So that's the ability to pull that configuration back from the runtime and create manageable components, manageable templates. So in our demo today, we'll create an application-centric demo. So we've got a cache monitoring app. Perhaps it relies on a data source. I'll bundle those into a template, map that to various stages in my software development lifecycle, dev, QA, stage, production. And we'll show how we do that in Talos so that we can create various templates out of our configuration and map them to a broader orchestration flow within an orchestration engine. Next, we'll talk about comparisons. Now, comparisons are the ability to compare 2 middleware instances. Now, this is great from a consistency perspective. So if I want to compare development to QA or QA to production, I can see all the differences right away within Talos. I got different values for this data source, or perhaps I have unexpected differences. That's part of the audit process that we're trying to go through in such a comparison. One of the interesting features we've implemented in Talos is we can then generate a template based on those differences, and I'll show that in the demonstration. Or another interesting approach is we could compare a configured environment to an empty middleware instance, an empty WebSphere cell in this case, so that I can generate a template of everything that we've configured since the installation. So I can then apply that template to other middleware instances I built. So for example, I could build one out in the cloud and apply a configuration that I had created on-premise so that I can bring that middleware up to the configuration level that I had on-premise. So that's another set of use cases we'll go through. And finally, our container strategy. So we have an integration with Docker, and I will show today how we integrate with Docker, how we can use Talos to transform templates from a traditional middleware environment. So for example, take our WebSphere example. Let's say we have 50 some odd applications running inside of WebSphere. We can chop that up into 50 application-centric templates, transform them over to, say, Liberty Profile, which is a leaner, smaller footprint Java runtime, marry that to a Docker container, and then before you know it, we've got 50 middleware, not middleware, but, well, let's call it microservices-friendly runtimes with Liberty and Docker hosting the applications separately. Of course, there's a lot more involved in a microservices transformation than just chopping up your infrastructure. But when it comes to the operational side, leveraging Talos can accelerate that in a very dramatic way. And along the way, or at the end, if I don't present it along the way, I like to present some of the various changes we've had in the last few months. So those that have been working with Talos can see some of the new features. Because every month we release a new version of Talos, and oftentimes that includes new features. So I will go over some of the latest features that we have inside of Talos. So let's start with that first use case, the ability to create and discover middleware. So for example, if I want to go through, on the left-hand side, I'm on my middleware instances tab here. I can see my environments, dev, production, and QA. I also have a workshop environment. Let's say I wanted to create a new environment, QA2 for example, give it an instance name, WAS9. I can choose the middleware that I want to build out, in this case a WebSphere cell, and I can start to design that cell. So I want a deployment manager, I want a standalone node, for example. And as I add these components, I have the ability, so take this node, for example, to decide where I want to put it. Perhaps I want to put it out in IBM SoftLayer. I can choose SoftLayer here, fill out the parameters here. So I want my API key, what is the data center I want to put it at, Amsterdam, for example. The sizing of the VMware, and it'll build the underlying VMware under this node before it then turns around and builds out the middleware itself. So we do have the ability to build it on-premise or in the cloud. I can keep it on-premise. I've got connection type details. If it's a Windows environment, I can use our own agent. If it's a Unix environment, I can tunnel it over SSH or use an SSH key, or I can put the password here. Of course, it's encrypted on the file system for us, but I can also use a key. all the details about the installation path for this node, for the deployment manager, what is the details around that. So all the different parameters I can add, various clusters and so forth, and standalone JVMs. And when I save that, it'll persist a project into the orchestration engine I'm integrated with. In this case, I'm integrated with Jenkins, but as you can see, I can choose Urban Code or Ansible. I won't drag this demonstration out and show all three of those. Again, if you're interested, email me. Rewind to the beginning to get my email, and I'll be happy to give you a demonstration of how we work with Ansible and how we work with the Urban Code as well. So that's the creation. We also have the discovery. So for example, take this one I'll actually run. So we'll create a QA2. We've got a QA environment. I'll create a secondary QA environment. We'll call it WAS9 as well. We choose the middleware type that we want here. WebSphere cell using SOAP in this case. It's a local host. I got it running here in my VMware. In fact, the console is right there. I'm going to give it the credentials to connect to that console. And I'm going to give it, well, I'm going to repeat the password for confirmation. And then I'm going to give it the path to the deployment manager. If you know WebSphere, again, the principles are the same for any middleware. But if you know WebSphere, you're probably familiar with some of these pathings and so forth that I'm typing here. And then we want the port for the SOAP port. Now this is going to run a job. 2000 and 2003, if I recall correctly, that's the port. I believe this console is running on the 20,000 range, so I got that correct. So we're going to run this job. This job is going to very quickly run through and pull the topology back into, it's going to discover that topology and pull it back into Talos. So this job's running. Notice we've got a jobs tab here. You can run multiple jobs. I could be discovering one. Somebody else could be running an activity. Another person could be doing a different discovery. So any job that's run will land here, and it is a thread safe. We can do multiple jobs at the same time, and these jobs are meant to mainly to connect out the pullback configuration. So anytime you want to import, multiple people can be importing multiple instances at the same time, so we can build those templates and generate them into our orchestration engine. It found it. I must have already chosen this environment, so I found it in Jenkins and just accepted the link to that one rather than override it. So I hit done here, and I have here my new topology here that I discovered. It's a running environment, so I can see it's got a cluster, and there's my cluster members, there's the cluster name, etc. I could, if that topology was to change, I could rediscover it, and it'll. So if I added a node or added an additional cluster, I can rediscover that as it changes. I can clone that topology in its entirety. So if I were to clone it out into QA3 and change maybe the host names underneath the nodes or put it out in the cloud, I can certainly do that. I can edit it and add attributes to this thing. So if I had a secondary node, I want to create a managed node and extend that cluster to this new managed node, I can save that, and it generates a project, by the way, in my orchestration engine over here that can then build out that piece of middleware. So I'll give you an example project, and we'll look specifically at the QA2 one that we built out in a moment when I start to add templates to it. But since this was a discovery, not a build out one, I will show very quickly a project that does the build out in this case. Give it a second to connect. Jenkins seems to be, my computer is waking up here today, it looks like. If I come back over here, while that's happening, because I want to multitask, we'll look at that in just a moment. We'll go back to that environment that we discovered, and what I want to do now is I want to read that configuration in. So I've covered, I'm going to go ahead and hit the button because this takes a couple minutes while I talk. I'm going to read everything that's running in that new environment so that I can then create some templates. What I'd done up to this point is I built out that middleware, I'd shown how we can build it out, how we can discover it, how we can alter that topology, how we can clone it out into the cloud, and so forth. Now we're talking about configuration management. This job's going to run out and collect all the details about that middleware instance, so all the various configuration aspects we see on the left-hand side here. Over in Jenkins, now that I'm finally logged in, let's look at an example project. So we've got a build project for WebSphere here. If I click on this, he's linked to a library that has all the steps necessary to then build out a new middleware instance. When I go through a creation wizard, it will automatically create a project with all the steps that I'm about to show you encapsulated in it, so that you can then build out that middleware. And we can rerun that, we can change the topology, regenerate that project to rebuild it because it's changed, or we can move the location to another set of hosts, etc. And we can see all that happen and affect that. The system is running slightly slow because I'm actively pulling in a massive way all the configuration back from that runtime. It'll speed up once that concludes. So if we look at the output of this job, we can see various variables coming down right now. So you can see all the various configuration elements of WebSphere coming back. There's my SI bus. There's some JMS information right there. Next will be JDBC, virtual host settings, and so forth. And so all the JVM settings, all that's coming back as a full import so that I can then begin to do some configuration management. If I go back to my Jenkins, I've pulled open that project so that I can look at all the various steps. And what I can see here is that it links to a library called build WebSphere cell. And that library, if I come over here, then encapsulates all the necessary steps to build and rebuild a WebSphere cell. And we've got similar constructs inside of Urban Code and Ansible. So we've got the same sort of libraries so that we can then build out these middleware instances. And we've got a secondary projects that do configuration management. Every time we create a template, we'll link it to that project so that you can then link that to a broader build and release project. So every time we do something in Talos, we are updating our orchestration engine. So over here, let's see if this sucker over here is done. He's still running. It should be close to the end here. You can see that it's pulling back now. What do we got here? Various core group, if you're familiar with that, inside of Talos, pulling back various core group settings now. Should be another 20 or 30 seconds, I believe, left on that. On the Jenkins side, we have our project here to build it out. And if I scroll down, slowly, because my poor VMware is taking a beating with that import I'm doing. And we can see all the steps. First, it does a stop and then an uninstall of everything in case it's already there. And then it's got a variety of steps that then do the installation and patching and creating the profiles and all that. That's specific to WebSphere. Again, other middleware instances, we've got other projects out there that then build those out in whatever way makes sense for that given middleware. Let me let that run for one more minute. Okay, I had paused the video slightly because it took about 3 or 4 minutes, a little longer than it usually does. Usually it takes just a couple of minutes, but I didn't want to fill dead air space, so I paused it. It is now complete. We can hit done here. We've run the configuration. My computer must be a little busier than normal with the middleware running and all these things running in the VMware. Anyway, so we've pulled the configuration back. Our next set of use cases are around templating. So we're going to go ahead and create a new template on that configuration we just pulled back. Let's call this new app demo one. Good enough, like that. We're going to choose what we want to put in it. In this case, I said I want to create an application-centric template, so we'll choose this dynamic cache monitor. We're going to find what are the variability points when we select this particular application. So for example, maybe I have map modules to servers. I'm going to click on this. I'm going to find the value here, which is mapped to a certain cluster. Perhaps that changes from environment to environment. So I give it a relevant name. We'll call it apps because that's the group. It's cache monitor is the name of the app. And the parameter is map modules to servers. So I hit save here. And down below, I've created this new variable called that. I've selected that. I think that's all I'll do for the application. So I've selected this application into this template. And let's say this application relies on a resource. In this case, let's say it relies on a data source. So I come down here. And under data sources, I go and find where my test data source is, which is I know the data source that I want. It's here at the cell level. And I select it, and I open it up, and I go, okay, now what changes in this data source? And let's just, for the sake of time, grab just a couple of things. Maybe the database name. Let's assume that changes with each environment. So I'm going to go and create a new value here. We'll call this, again, the group, JDBC, the data source name, test, and this is database name, for example. And I hit save here, and I've got a new variable called database name. And by the way, I can always see where this variable links to by clicking here, and it highlights in green, or down here it shows me where that variable is linked to, because often when you create a very big template, it's very helpful to see where these things are linked. And now I can also, by the way, link to multiple. I can link a variable to multiple configuration elements. So, for example, the cell name may be referenced multiple places. Well, I don't have to create 20 or 30 cell name variables. I can link that variable to various aspects within the configuration. So let's go to the port number here and let's create one there. And I think we'll stop there just for time's sake. One moment, I have sound in the background. I'll have to turn that off. Pardon the interruption. So we're going to select the port name here. Number, sorry. Well, the value for it. So we're going to say jdbc.test.port number. I was using lowercase, so I want to be consistent, so I'll do it like that. So I've got 3 variables, 2 of them linked to my data source and 1 linked to my application. I'm going to hit save and close here. I've now got a template linked to my QA2 environment. It's called new demo 2. I can create a payload. I can view that payload. I can see that within that payload I only have my cache monitor app, that's this guy, and I only have my data source, that's this guy. Actually, specifically, it's this data source here. If I go and look at my project inside of Jenkins, as I mentioned earlier, it's always updating our orchestration engine. So I hit to leave this page. If I go and find that particular project, and what did we say? It was QA2, yeah, I believe it was QA2 was 9. So let's go find QA2 was 9. QA2 being the environment, was 9 being the instance name. And I have him right here. I'll click on him. I will click on configuration here. And what I'm going to show you is that template is now linked to this environment via a step, which we will see as soon as this thing finishes loading. And here he is down here. I think I called it new app demo, yeah, that's what I called it. So we've got this step right here. And he links to a library called apply websphere template. Which template? The main parameter says new app template. As I add templates, so if I add additional templates to this environment, so say this sample app, for example, he will also show up in that project. And more importantly, I can rearrange the step order, which is quite nice. And this project, as a result, will update accordingly. So if I hit refresh here, and I'll come back to it in a minute because everything's quite slow. But when we come back and look at this in a minute, we'll see, oh, not too bad. We'll see that the additional sample app is now loaded in there, and the order of operations has changed. I now have sample app happening first, followed by that new app. So if I go down here, I've got new app demo, and above that, I've added that sample app, which we will see here, right there. So the order now is sample app, new app demo going to be applied, same order as here. So I can rearrange that order as I go. And now if I click on edit, and by the way, I have an inverted view. This is the view of the middleware instance, and I can see the templates associated with it. So for example, here is the one that I had created down here. I can have an inverted view. I go on templates here. I can find that new app demo guy, that template, and I can see that he's linked to this middleware instance. And just like I can add templates to middleware, I can add I can add templates to middleware. I can add middleware instances to templates. It's just an inversion of the same concept. So for example, he's linked to QA2. Let's go ahead and link him to, for example, a dev environment. We'll link him here to this dev environment. And let's choose one more. Let's add him to production as well. So we've got a QA2 environment as well as a production environment. You can see the effect of that here. I can see that I'm linked to this middleware instance, this dev instance, and this production instance. Oh, and by the way, here are the variability points, and I can see that here's the column for QA2 and the values for that. Here's the column for production. When I select it, it highlights it in green and moves it to the left, and I can put in values for that. I can edit this template. When I hit edit on him, I can rev up the version. Perhaps I want to create a secondary version of this template, so I hit version 2. Notice in the template right now, all I see is the cache monitor and the data source. Let's map them over, back over to QA2. Let's say that we've changed something in that environment, we've reread that environment in, and now we want to add, in addition to this data source, some other resource. Maybe a particular JMS resource that we added to the environment. So now that I've overlaid it, I can see all the configuration elements. I can choose a JMS provider, for example. Let's just take the first one, just because I don't want to go and be too specific and start creating tokens and all that. You've seen that concept already. So I'll just add this whole JMS. Let's pretend it doesn't have any variability points, so we won't do any tokenization on it. We'll hit save here. We've got a new version, so we can then apply that version to QA2. We view that version, and guess what? We can see that JMS element now as well. So we've got that app, that data source, and now that JMS element. So I'm going to close that. Of course, it would update the project. I could play that project and then apply that out to dev, to QA, or to production, assuming that I've applied the appropriate values. So as you can see, the templating is really the key sweet spot for this solution. It's the same across all products. If I go to a data power product, all the middleware or appliances that we manage, and I want to create a new data power template, I start to select components within that. I go to MQ, for example, and I say new MQ template. I've already previously done a read-in of that MQ environment, so I could start to select a queue manager, various queues, and create variables and so forth on these kind of things as well. I got to give it a name. I'm just going to cancel. But the idea behind me showing you this briefly there as WebLogic is that it's just not WebSphere. All the concepts I'm showing in this demo apply to all the middleware that we then manage. So that's the second area that I really wanted to focus on, this idea of templating, right, and mapping this, creating these application-centric templates and mapping them to various stages in my software development lifecycle. The next thing I want to show is our comparison features. So let's find a WebSphere environment, stay with the WebSphere theme, this QA environment, and let's compare him to, let's say, production here. So we're going to, well, let me cancel this real quick. I don't know if I selected the right one. We'll select this guy. Got to compare apples to apples. Let's compare him to QA. Yep, so there we go. I hit OK here. And what it does is then presents me with this screen. On the left-hand side, I can see my production instance. On the right-hand side, I can see my QA instances. And this is basically all the configuration. I'm highlighting in yellow various attributes that change from environment to environment. I can create a filter so I can just see those differences. So it collapses it down and says, oh, for this data source here, you've got a database name difference and a port number difference here, where in production the value is 50,001 and the value for the port number in QA is 50,000. And again, here's another data source called data source 2, and he's got different values on the database name, on the port number, and on the server name. So very helpful way of being able to quickly see all the differences in your environment. One of the really neat things is I can create a template based on these differences. So if I say create a template on all these differences, we'll call this a differences template. I'm not being very creative in this demo. And now we've got a new template. If I go over to template called differences template, did I not hit save? I may not have hit save on that. I can do it again. That's no problem very quickly. Again, we go to production and we say compare with QA. Okay. And we say new compare. I can spell here, compare. That's better. Now it says please wait, and it generated the differences here, and by the way, added it in Jenkins. So we come over here to our templates and we have new compare here, and we hit edit on this guy. And we can see that it selected all the things that it found different, which was what? One data source here called test, another one called test2, and the variability components that we found, it tokenized. So it found that the database name was different, so it created a token on that. So when I start to add environments to this, I could create a template based on the differences and then promote those differences to other environments to create consistency. The other very quick thing I want to show on the comparisons, a very valuable feature. I may not take this all the way out to the end because it might take a little while, but if I compare a middleware instance with a blank cell, I'll go ahead and do it. It doesn't take too long. I hit OK here, and what is it doing? It's comparing an empty instance with nothing in it with everything I've configured on this middleware instance. The reason behind wanting to do that is to create a template. So I can create a template based on everything I've done post-installation in this environment, so that I can then that template I can then apply to various middleware instances. So for example, it says all these things are different, and it starts to highlight them, and there'll be a lot of differences here, by the way, of things that I have configured that weren't in the original. And obviously I can create a new everything after install. And I hit OK here. And I create a new instance of everything that I've configured since the installation. This is great if I want to build out a new environment in the cloud, and then I want to pull all the configurations I applied to an on-premise one and put it in that new cloud one. I've got this template with everything possible inside of it. And this is going to be a big template that I have applied all the application, all the resources, and you can see all those things here, all the different things that I've created since then. So that's our comparison. The last area I want to focus on, and then we'll show a couple of features and conclude the video, is around our container strategy. So we've got this Liberty demo. I got this Liberty demo base image running with containers, and these containers show up here. The way we typically start this scenario is we create a container image. We go through this wizard. We give it a name. So we'll call it new demo. I won't go through to the end of this because it takes a little bit of time, and I want to try to cover as much ground as I can, but I'll show you how it looks as I go through it. Hold on, let me start over. I made a mistake here. Let me dismiss this. Let me go and call this new demo, for lack of a better word. Image version 1. We want to do Liberty. And we want to create it based on CentOS, right? And because we are creating this inside of a container, the topology editor is very limited, so we're not going to talk about collectives. If it was a base website, we wouldn't talk about ND clustering or collectives and stuff forth in Liberty, or other type clustering mechanics or clustering like, let's say, ish mechanics, because it doesn't make sense running in a container. So in this case, I just create a single JVM, we'll call it test, and we're going to leave all the defaults of just a single Liberty 1 JVM running inside of this container. The next step in the wizard, I can start to add various templates to it. So I've got this dictionary app template. I can create a dev variable set, because maybe I want to create a dev container instance of this. I can create a QA container. So all of my various, I can toggle the variables. So these are the variables associated with this dictionary app template, which includes a dictionary app and a data source. So I can give it all these values here. I won't go through all that, but the idea is I can now give it values specific to dev or values specific to QA when I create that container. The next area is what are my build out activities. So when I build the base image, what are the steps that I need to do? Talos has a variety of what we call activities, and you can see some of those activities here, and I'll highlight them after this section on containers. But these activities are things like start a server, stop a server, apply a fixback, and these are the build out activities to create that base image. So we can rearrange the order here as necessary, so that we can say these are the steps to create that base image. And finally, we have the instantiation activities. We want to create the containers. What do we want to do? We want to apply all the templates. So in this case, I've only got the dictionary app template at the top, but I could add a whole variety of templates to this thing, and it'll apply all those templates. And the last thing it does is start the server. If I wanted to do other things, I could add those activities here. I would hit save and build. Under Docker, I would have here at the end of it these images running. I've got that Liberty demo one that you see now running in that environment. And then I can go ahead and create containers, right, based on that. And the way I would do that is just the Docker way. So I will look at my history to show you how we did it last time. I'll do a grep for Docker. And you can see that we've done this Docker, this guy right here. I can go ahead and run a secondary one. Why not? We'll go ahead and do, we'll give it map it over to port 9082. We'll give it a, I didn't give the variable set values. I don't think I'll do this right now. I think because I have to go back and give values in that, otherwise it'll be an error. But the idea when I run this is that it'll show up here under the containers, and I can see them with the green, play button if it's successfully running, or red if it's just stopped, and we can start the container and stop the container from within Talos. I'm going to hit reconfiguration here. So one of the next things we can do is we can see all the containers running under that base image. And as they're running, I can select any given container. I can read that configuration back, okay, so that I can then edit the template that was associated with that template. So if I was to say, let's say I had a farm of 50 some odd containers running based off of this base image with these templates mapped over to it, I can select one, modify, do a deployment there, read that configuration back into my runtime, edit the template. Once I've edited the template, save it, and then I can then edit my, I'll let this run. So for example, I go over to my template called dictionary app. He's over here. I can edit this template and I can overlay him against a native environment or a Liberty environment. So here's my native runtime environment called dev, or I can select a Liberty runtime environment with a container. It finds all the differences. This configuration is absent in that environment because I haven't run it against it, whereas there's no differences here. It's saying that's all net new. But if I had finished reading that in, if I had applied it earlier, I would then be able to select new components, hit save, give it a new version here on this container. So I can see that this particular Liberty template is mapped not only to this native running environment in a cloud or on-premise, but also to this Liberty container. I can see this whale here to show that. So this job's probably complete. He's read it in, and I can also edit it from having clicked on the container itself. I can now edit this template, and I can add additional attributes to it via this way. Once that's done, I go to my base container here, which is this guy here. I can hit edit on him. I can go destroy all my containers, rev this up to version 2, create a new base image, and then instantiate all 50 of them again. So in this way, I can share templates across native. I can move them into the container. And to wrap up this section, this is a really powerful feature that we have. We can not only run these out in the containers, but we can transform them from traditional middleware into these container-friendly runtimes. So let's take, for example, that new app demo that we just created, right? If you recall, it's got a data source and a JMS attribute, I believe. I'm going to uncheck that one and create a version 3. I just want a data source in this case and the application itself, and I want to transform those two bits. So I hit save and close. I've got version 3 here. I'm going to apply version 3 here. We can view him. We can see that we've got just the data source and this application. So now I'm going to take this new demo app, demo template, and I want to transform him over to Liberty. I'll call it that. I hit OK. It runs a quick job. Job's fairly fast. Done. I hit done here. I go to my templates under Liberty now. I have a new app, Liberty template. If I hit edit on this template, it's the same two elements, but you'll notice that it's laid out a little bit differently. In this case, it's in Liberty, so everything's under the application, this server XML in this case. My data source is a little bit different looking. He's down here because the way it's arranged, obviously within Liberty, is different than WebSphere. So it created a slightly different looking template, but an appropriate template, and it preserved all the variability components down here and so forth. And so in that way, I can create and transform from traditional WebSphere to Liberty on containers. And the story behind that might be you have 50 applications running in a shared monolithic WebSphere cell. I want to chop them up into 50 application-specific templates, transform them over to Liberty, map that over to containers, and then boom, I've got 50 applications running in their own containers inside of Liberty. Obviously, moving to microservices isn't that easy, right? It's not only about the operations side. You've got some changes you need to do on the various applications, and we're not taking that into account. But if you had all that ready and you can group that into a nice container and you're ready to do that, operationally speaking, delivering that and making that transformation can just be a few clicks with Talos. A couple of things I want to show. I talked about activities. Each middleware that we manage, so that really concludes the 4 key areas that are on middleware, creation instances, discovering instances, modifying that topology, creating templates, comparing middleware environments, and then how can we then containerize those middleware instances and transform them to microservice-friendly runtimes. Before I conclude this video, I wanted to cover a couple of other features because this is a deep dive. We want to show as much as we can about Talos. So if we go to our WebSphere, these are all our various toolkits. We can see here all the various activities that we support. Not just creating templates, but starting a node, stopping a deployment manager, stopping a cluster. And by the way, we can even run that activity from here. So we can give it a context, and we can add arguments, and we can run that. So for example, I find it easier to run it from this perspective. So if I come over here, and I want to come here, and I want to run a job, run an activity on WAS, and we can search for that activity here. We'll call it, oops, it must be, get on that filter there. Stop, for example, DMGR. That gets takes to this screen. I don't need any additional arguments. I can hit run activity. The job runs, and it'll run a job. I got to give it a run mode. We'll say, well, we can run local in this case. Run activity, and a job runs, and it'll go and stop that. Most of the time, we want to generate these various steps into an orchestration engine as part of a flow. But there are times when you want to manage your environment, and we can run any activity you see here ad hoc, graphically, as well as from the command line. This shows you how you run it from the command line here. You can see that right there. So that's our ability to execute activity. That's for anyone that's been with Talos for a while. The ability to do that graphically and not just from the command line is something new. We always relied on the orchestration engine, but now we say in a one-off way, you want to run a given activity, we'll allow you to do that from the GUI. Another area that we've added, we've always said that the audit comes from the orchestration engine. Well, now, if you're going to run an activity or create a template or change that template, we're going to show you an audit history. So we pull from the logs and splash to the console. I'm logged in as admin, right? So you can see all the various things that I've done. It's fairly important if you're trying to comply and understand how these templates are changing, because one of the things we can do, and this is the last area I'm going to show, is we have security. So we've got the ability to create users and groups. So I've got, for example, a group called, what groups do I have? I've got, I have no idea what's in these groups, to be honest, but I've got various groups and so forth here, and I've got users I can add into those groups. I can map this into LDAP, so if I want to integrate this with LDAP, I can do that. And on middleware instances and templates themselves, I can then modify these guys. So for example, let's find this guy. We can set permissions on here, and we can say, let's give him, change read, write, for the WAS group for this guy, so he's got read access and write access. I can save that. I can do the same thing for templates over here. So if I want to set permissions on this template, I can say, well, this group or that group can edit this template but read it, not write it. The idea behind it is if I log in, maybe I can only see all the JBoss instances and on only non-production at that, and I can create a template, but I can't map that template over to production. I can only save it, notify somebody, an operations guy comes in, he can log in, he can see that template, he can then say, okay, now I'm okay with that template, I'll go ahead and map that over to production, and I can come over here, and that guy can then add that particular template to the production instance in this case, and then modify that template and the values, right? So here are the values specific to production. So we can create a self-service scenario where the non-operations guys can then manage their development environment, say I've created this template, and then an operations guy can log in, have a look at that template, make sure it complies to everything you expect it to comply to in terms of governance and so forth, and then that operations guy can map that into a production instance and so forth. Or we can silo somebody down to just JBoss or just Webster or just MQ. So that's a way in which we can sort of control who can do what within Talos through the various security mechanics. So that concludes my deep dive demo. I hope you found it helpful. Again, if it was a little too fast and a little too deep, I do recommend Phil Leeper's series of migrating from on-premise into the cloud scenarios. They're about 5 minutes each, about 4 or 5 videos, easy to find on our YouTube channel. And I would recommend you go through that as a sort of a higher level, very quick, use case driven versus feature driven demonstration. Again, my name is Scott Bybee. I appreciate your time, and that's all.